All right, so this is our first ever live mental health stream on Twitch. SoSoSapien on Twitch, Mind Body Connection on YouTube. Today, we're going to be talking about happiness and what it is and how we might define it. So there's obviously a lot of different angles that we can go at for this. The angle that I'm going to be going at is looking at how different psychologists have defined it and what variables they look at. Yeah, 2 weeks. I'm gonna get excited. All right, what do you think happiness is? Um, all right, so the way I'm gonna go look at it is there's an acronym that I really like that covers a lot of different components. So I'm gonna write that out and then we're gonna kind of break it down. Pre, gan, mam, t, s. All right, so there's a lot there. I think before jumping right into the longer acronym, I think it's important to note that, like, obviously every person has different things that they find meaningful, that they value, that they would say make them happy. So what psychologists have attempted to do, and I mean many philosophers for thousands of years, right, is try to have some sort of system of values or emotions or way of going about the world that lead to the most well-being. So while we can certainly look at how people say, what things people say make them happy, what things correlate to life satisfaction and mental health and longevity, it still is kind of it can be studied scientifically in that sense and looking at how people define it, but there's still a very subjective component to what it actually means to have well-being. What's up, Hillbilly? I'm doing I'm a therapist. I'm finishing up my master's degree, and I'm doing some streams where I talk about different mental health concepts, and try to have conversation with people, talk about theories. So this one, I guess, kind of broadly speaking, is just that what is happiness and defining it, kind of how the science defines it. How are you? And what do you think? What makes people happy? What is mental health? What is well-being? Um, so the acronym that I'm working with is a combination of different theories that have been proposed. Martin Seligman, who's known as the founder of positive psychology, proposed a five-factor model, which is PERMA, which is in here. And then Carol Ryff incorporated her own 6 factors. There's work by Ed Diener, who did work on life satisfaction. And then this is kind of a combination of a bunch of different theories that I like, that was also used by a psychologist named Barry Kaufman. He kind of like added and expanded on the acronym. Ara says internal and external harmony. I like that. What does it mean to be harmonious, do you think? And I think that when looking at this too, having balance and harmony is also exceptionally important, between, I mean, all areas of our life, whether that be physical health, mental health, relationships, career, intellectual achievement, creative achievement. So the acronym kind of bringing everything together. I'll just define each of them and then go back and kind of go into more detail. So we have positive emotion, relationships, engagement, growth, accomplishment, negative emotion, tolerance, acceptance, mastery, autonomy, meaning. This one's kind of funky and I like it. Transcendent experiences. And satisfaction with life. Yeah, and you said equilibrium and balance, kind of that theme of making everything work with each other, right? I think a lot of different cultures have defined that different ways, right? Yin and yang, karma, being in the present moment, etc. Um, so, of course, the way that we define it, you could say, because a lot of the research is being done in Western culture has a Western spin to it, but I think that a lot of the things that psychologists and philosophers have started doing when they study it scientifically is incorporated different ideas different cultures have had that seem to have a lot of relevance and significance still. Um, so positive emotion, obviously, that's part of being happy, right? And so, I mean, generally, we don't say, I guess, happiness, I think, in itself is kind of one positive emotion. So this is more about, I guess, holistic well-being or having, quote unquote, a good life. So positive emotion can mean a lot of different things. It can be happiness, it can be joy, it can be love, it can be serenity, it can be peace, it can be being ecstatic, it can be feeling connected to people, exuberance. And there's a theory by Barbara Fredrickson. She has a theory known as broaden and build. And when that posits is a lot of positive emotions aren't just quote unquote good or healthy in of themselves, which they are, I think most of the time. I mean, I think we could get into also, if you just taking drugs, is that quote unquote a good way of finding pleasure? And there's different viewpoints on that. But when we say feel admiration for someone, that can trigger more like it can put us in touch with what we value, right? Like I really admire, like I was watching Healthy Gamer Dr. K's channel, and it in part inspired me to do this. This is something I've been thinking about, but he started talking a lot about how the gut biome and your microbiome affects mental health. So it kind of sparked this like, wow, I want to learn more about that. And then even like watching Cheese speedrun Mario, it really made me want to learn. When we experience like a deep sense of love or connection to someone, a lot of the times we want to cherish that, right? We want to hold on to the person. We have a lot of gratitude. When we feel at peace, there's a sense of contentment and like things are all right. So all of these positive emotions can build on one another. And when we're in a good mood, it's also obviously easier to kind of capitalize on those resources. So positive emotions, I mean, they feel positive, right? They feel enjoyable, desirable. We want to repeat them. And they also allow us to build other resources down the line as well. So relationships, I mean, this means relationships of all sorts, all social connection that have a positive influence on our life. So that can be romantic, family, friends, community, community, lovers, coworkers. And there's some research, though, there's a Harvard study that followed a generation of individuals. I believe one of them was upper class. They were actually attending Harvard, and then different individuals who were in lower socioeconomic statuses. And the strongest predictor of well-being after following them for most of their life was the strength of their relationships. And that also has all types of tight correlations in various markers of mental health, as well as longevity in physical health. So people are, really important, right? I think that's having people around that you trust and that you care about and build you up, and that you can tell positive news to, and you can tell negative news to, and will support you. People are a huge, huge source of joy, love, connection, and also suffering, right? Potentially, if you're surrounded by people who are abusive or not supportive, that can be terrible. So nurturing and finding relationships is incredibly important for mental health. Engagement, that it's also called flow, being engaged with what you're doing. And the concept of flow is finding a balance of being challenged while not being overwhelmed. So flow is a state that we feel when it's often associated with things like playing music, freestyle rapping, playing sports, having sex, being at the peak of a mountain. Well, actually, I guess a peak of a mountain could be, yeah, that could be flow-inducing. Just really, really engaging experiences where you lose your sense of self, you lose your sense of time. You kind of are just completely in the moment and engage with what you're doing. You're in the zone, you're in flow. So those are asked, is flow a meditative state? That's an interesting question. I think that in a sense it is. I like the way that Sam Harris differentiates flow from mindfulness, where flow is being absorbed in what you're doing, and mindfulness, flow is being absorbed in what you're doing and losing your sense of self because you're so absorbed in what you're doing, where mindful states, or what we might call meditative states, you are paying attention to your experience so that you notice you're losing your sense of self. So I think when you're in a mindful or meditative state, and you can kind of go in and out of flow, and you realize like you see yourself, quote unquote, becoming more engaged in the moment, and you're really connecting with and feel present with your breath or whatever it is that you're doing. Whereas in flow, that it isn't necessarily there. You're not aware that you're in flow because you're in flow. You're so engaged with what's actively happening. And I think that there's research on like savoring positive experiences that suggests it's very, very good to do that, to just kind of really take note of when something good is happening. And I think flow and mindfulness can have a really cool synergistic effect where you can be, say you're having really good sex, or you're really having a good workout, or playing an instrument really well. You can kind of be in that moment and then notice, wow, this is a really amazing experience. And you kind of pop out of it, so to speak, and then you go back into it. Yeah. Sam Harris explained it that way, Ara, and I was like, I love the way that he put that. And I think it taps into, I don't know, the human condition really well, of just being lost in the moment, lost in thought, aware of thought, and how we can like go in between those things. So finding engagement in life is something that I think a lot of us don't prioritize. I feel like I didn't think about things in that way for a long time, but especially with work, if you can find something that really challenges you and helps you grow, I think that's super important. So G, grow. You need to be at least 5 feet tall to be truly happy. So, growth can be defined in a lot of different ways. I think the simplest way I tend to think of it is, there can be tangible improvement, right? Like if you run a 5K in 30 seconds faster than you did last time, that's improvement. With Mario, if I can get a PB that's 20 seconds faster, that's a tangible improvement. Getting a degree, getting a job, losing weight, those things are more tangible and are very important. And I think there's also a growth that can always be happening, which is less obvious, especially to other people, but that can mean like feeling more at peace, or being more educated about something. That could come from reading a book, or it could come from life experience. So over time, I think ideally we learn more about ourselves, we learn more about the world, we can cope better, we're able to use our strengths better, we understand our weaknesses better, we relate to people more positively, we have a deeper sense of meaning. So trying to find that, I guess, upward trajectory as much as we can is very important. And not putting so much weight on ourselves that we always need to be productive, right? I think that's something I fall into a lot. Accomplishment, I think that ties into growth closely, but I think, like I said, they can be subtly different because maybe getting a degree is a form of an accomplishment and a form of growth, but growth can be more subtle. Accomplishment is more of the, I don't know, getting the degree, setting and meeting goals. Like a huge part of how our positive emotion system works is by setting and fulfilling goals. Even if we don't know it, like if we're trying to get a McDonald's burger or a Wendy's burger and we're driving there and we hit traffic, we're going to get really frustrated, partially because we're hungry, but partially because our goal is being interfered with. And really that can apply to essentially everything. Like if it's explicitly stated, like if our goal is to do 50 push-ups and we have a stomach ache or we only do 30, that can be frustrating at first. So the setting and pursuing of goals is in some sense more important than not more important than the achieving, but that is very sustaining, and very important for getting out of depression too, is setting just even little concrete things that you can accomplish and look forward to. And I mean, there's also a whole literature on goal setting where they should be specific, measurable, actionable or attainable, reasonable and time bound, which we can go into at another time. But having goals and achieving them is very important. I mean, I think there's something to be said about, all who wander are not lost, right? And being spontaneous. But I do really believe that having some type of driving force, meaning, or goal that you're setting in your pursuits is very important. So this is sometimes this is sometimes defined or worded as negative emotion tolerance or having less negative emotions. And I think that's certainly true, that as you become more resilient and have a more fulfilling life, hopefully you're going to have less negative emotions, but that's not always the case. And I don't think it's wise to attempt to not to attempt to have less negative emotion necessarily, but life is difficult and tragic things happen, and that's unavoidable. So life is going to be filled with negative emotion. So I think it's more important to think of it as doing more and more things that are or avoiding more things that are in your control that bring negative emotion, and being able to function in negative emotion, or sometimes not, right? I think that's the acceptance piece. Sometimes you lose a loved one and you have to take time off for a while and you're really struggling, and that's fine too. But I think generally speaking, the trajectory if you're in a reasonable society, socioeconomic state, etc., is you become more tolerant of negative emotions and learn to adapt to them. Alan Watts goes through the waves, absolutely. I love Alan Watts. I love the idea of thinking them as waves too. And I think that can be a learning thing too. Like, I remember, when I was younger, the idea of asking a girl out was terrifying, right? So I wouldn't even do that. And then, getting rejected, that was so terrible. And then over time, it's like, okay, like I'm going to get rejected sometimes. And like, I feel negatively when I get rejected, but it doesn't hit me as hard. And I think as you mature and you become, psychologically healthier, hopefully, you become more and more resilient to things like that. And you can see like negative emotions are a part of life, and have tools to cope with them. And I think with reducing the frequency and coping better, I think a big part of that too is like, if you don't feel great after eating like a half a pizza and then sleeping for 4 hours, I think that not doing those things when you can is better than doing them frequently, right? Or like avoiding substances, exercising, meditating, and things like that. That can be helpful. Hello, Nick and Katoon. How are you? How do I be unhappier? That will be a different stream, but I would recommend spending as much time as you can lying in your bed and hiring a maid to bring your food into your bed and never leaving your house. Tell yourself that you're going to, in one day, clean your whole house and write a 10-page paper, and then do neither. And then when you try to go to sleep, I would recommend going over every single awkward thing that happened during the day and assuming that every interaction you had that was awkward means that everyone you interact with doesn't like you. I think that's a good starting point, and we can elaborate more on that at another time. 4 hours of sleep. So 4 hours of sleep. Just Katana Nick is probably eating ham. All right. What kind of ham? I hope it's happiness ham. If anyone's interested, or if you haven't seen 7 Ways to Maximize Misery by, is it CC Gray? He has a great video on that that's taken from How to Be Miserable. I think it's Randy Patterson. That's a great one. I'm glad you have that down, Kat. Something we can keep working on. Turo, you're feeling sad listening to this. Oh, what's kind of the description of how to be sad? Yeah, I mean, that video really impacted me. It kind of like, it made me look at myself and be like, wow, like I'm doing so many of these things. And I think the reverse psychology can be really helpful sometimes to get yourself to look at, like, I think obviously it's useful for people to say, this is how you can battle depression and how to be happy, but it was really impactful for me to just be like, oh no, like let's how do you be sad? Let's try to do it. Let's think about it. You left your house for 5 minutes and you had an awkward interaction, and do you know this person? Well, this is part of the acceptance thing, right? We're all awkward, right? Awkward happens. It was a stranger. What happened? What was the what was the interaction? Wait, I got a notification. Turo! Thank you for following. I appreciate it. I'm glad my notifications are working too. My follow notifications. Yeah, that can be your action, right? Don't something awkward happens. It's like, I got to avoid. Um, yeah, awkward happens, pain happens, um, and we can just set as many standards for ourselves as we want that we'll never meet, right? We can compare ourselves to, there's always going to be some, unless we have a world record, right? There's going to be somebody that is better than us at everything, right? But nobody can ever be better than you at being you, right? Very cliche, but I think that it's very powerful to phrase it like that. And the idea of like wrestling with emotions versus accepting, I think sometimes acceptance is thought of as like a passive project, right? Like, oh, like, I don't have enough money and my girlfriend's going to leave me and whatever, I just accept it. And I like thinking of it as more of an active process. That's a kind of a way of framing it that something called acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, looks at, where it's not about telling yourself, I can't do anything. It's about saying, like, okay, what can I do and what can't I do? And when your brain starts telling you, you should do this thing that you can't do, or this shouldn't be how it is, that really doesn't become helpful, right? You can tell yourself something should or should not be a certain way as much as you want, but if you just fixate on that, there isn't a lot of goal setting that comes from that. So it's about feeling the emotions and assessing what you can do in the situation. And I even feel like when you're trying to accomplish something, the path to that is accepting what is actively happening, right? Like if you're trying to lose weight, and you're not, and you gain 3 pounds, you have to be like, okay, I gained 3 pounds. What did I do wrong? You know, if you're just like, nope, like my scale's broken, or like something's, I don't know. There's so many ways you can justify that, right? Yeah, wake up and continue the cycle. All right, mastery. I guess accomplishment and mastery, that's pretty, and growth, those are pretty tightly tied together. I think mastery is more of a sense of like tangible. I guess it would be more feeling some type of expertise or competence. Like, I think it's more like it goes along with growing and accomplishing things, but I think when you have a sense of yourself as like I'm a decent speaker, or I'm a decent friend, I'm a decent cook, I think having that internalized in your identity is very, very helpful. And again, one of the biggest parts of the positive emotion system is approaching goals. So I mean, that's, I guess, part of becoming an adult, right? You have some area, well, traditionally, right? Having some area of expertise that you can give back to the community, or help yourself with. And I think it's the opposite of feeling hopeless, right? Or helpless is feeling a sense of competence. That part of the Pragananam is what gets me going most of the time. What, the mastery or the acceptance one? Yeah, Ara, the better you get, the more you realize you suck. I forget what that phenomenon is called, but there was some gentleman, I don't remember what field he was in, but there's like some curve, right, where it's like you start learning a little bit about something and you're like, I know everything. And then you start learning more, you're like, there's so much I don't know. And then eventually you get to a point where you're like, okay, I know some stuff. And I think that's fair. I think that's been my experience for the most part. What do you mean it gets you going, Charles? Do you mean like you struggle with it, or it's something that it like motivates you? Um, the autonomy piece kind of ties into, I mean, they all tie into each other at some capacity where, um, I think this is like about trusting yourself. And I know for sure that I've only ever lived in the United States, in Massachusetts, and I'm aware that the idea of being autonomous is very Western culture. The United States is one of, if not the most individualistic nations in the world, right? So I understand that there's different ways of looking at that, but I do think that even in the context of maybe a more collectivist setting, trusting yourself to be able to help other people is important, right? Like that's a big part of, I mean, that's one of the biggest things people think of when raising kids. Like you want to raise kids to have a sense that they're loved and they can trust other people, but that they can function on their own, right? That's like, it can be a huge, huge source of negative emotion. And certainly for me, like a big part of when I was depressed, when I was in my late teens, early 20s, was I felt like I couldn't do things for myself. So have like trusting yourself and just learning how to navigate situations on your own is important. But I think a big part of that is also being able to ask for help. So it's kind of like trusting yourself to ask for help. And I think that kind of goes more into like trusting other people too. But yeah, you can lack many things. You were smart during school and college, a couple of talents, some other things I'm sure about myself that make me say, okay, I'm better than this. I can overcome. So if I'm reading that right, you have a sense like there are some things you're good at, um, and you say you can lack many things. So it's like all right that you lack some things. Yeah, I think there's something. Oftentimes we divide, psychologists divide um, comp- self competence into what they call self efficacy, and there's something called global self efficacy and domain specific self efficacy. So domain specific, and there's some debate. Some people say like global doesn't exist, but domain specific is like, one second, I got a follower. Smells of ham. Is that Nick? Hello, Smells of Ham. I love your name, whether or not that is Nick, and it's just a coincidence. Thank you for the follow. Yeah, wouldn't that be weird if it wasn't Nick? Um, it is. Hello. It might be. That is not a confirmation. I need to get better. Okay, there we go. Like swapping between. Um, oh, yeah. So, domain specific self-efficacy is like I am good at guitar, right? I am good at cooking. I am good at speaking. And global is I am a competent person generally. And I think that is a weird idea because like what does that mean? Like if you feel you're competent generally, what does that mean? Like, are you going to look at anything you do and feel you're competent? So there's some debate as to like, is that even a thing? And I feel like it's a thing in the sense that I think that your global self-efficacy is the ability, the extent to which you trust yourself to do things that you're not competent in, right? I think that's an important one, and it's more abstract, but I think that kind of comes from trusting yourself and doing things more autonomously. Feel like you have worth since you have something. Yeah, that's awesome. I definitely so something that I've struggled with like for pretty much my whole life is like having and sustaining romantic relationships. So what I did for a long time was I put most of my self-worth into my ability to like find a romantic partner and keep a romantic partner. And since I've struggled with that, my sense of self-worth was pretty low. But there were a lot of other things that I had going that I didn't see. And now it's been like as I work on everything, including like pursuing romantic partners, that element of my life has gotten better because, and I'm less like worried about it. I'm not like, oh God, like I need like it doesn't feel like I'm like as desperate almost. And so I think that there is kind of a I don't know holistic or bi-directional, however many direction relationship between working on things that you're good at and working things that you're not good at and how they kind of influence each other and like having a balanced look or perspective on it. Having a sense of meaning. I don't remember the exact numbers, but there was a study where, and again, I don't know, I've heard of this multiple times. I wish I knew the actual numbers and like the exact dates, but it was something like in the 70s. They asked college students in a certain college, like, what are the things that are most important to you? And having a meaningful life philosophy was like one of the top ones in the 70s. And it was something like, again, I don't remember the exact numbers, but like 65, let's say, percent of college students said that. And like having a lot of money was like 30 something. And then in like 2010 or something recently, it was like flipped. Like having a meaningful life philosophy was like way lower. Um, and I think that I think having money is I'll talk about money and a little bit more extensively in like another stream and how that affects happiness or how it influences it. But I think that having a meaningful life philosophy and having value systems and feeling like your life is worth something and what you're doing is worth something is incredibly important, right? Like one of the biggest components that contributes to depression and characterizes it is feeling like things are like not worthwhile or you're not worthwhile or you're even a burden on people. And I think that meaning is the thing that can help us sustain through very difficult times, right? That's something that Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who was a Holocaust survivor, he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote extensively about that having really believing like your life is worth it, even if you're not religious or spiritual and you don't believe in a metaphysical like ultimate cause or meaning. You can absolutely, and I don't know, I think I believe in that, like to some extent, and I'm kind of on the fence. I think that that's more of like a, I don't know, spiritual realm, but like people feel things, I guess, and that's meaningful. Like the relationship I have with my family and my loved ones, that's like meaningful to me, right? And I think that what you do matters. Like what you do influences other people, and what you do influences how you feel. Um, so I think it's really important to be able to articulate to yourself like what is meaningful, like what matters. Why do I do what I do? Internal self-worth is a bear all on its own. What do you mean? Like it's a difficult to tackle, as a bear certainly is. This one, I mean, not as well researched. There is some research on how religious, spiritual peak experiences influence well-being, which is really fascinating. I think it's a little bit more esoteric than the other ones, but um, this is something that the psychologist William J. I mean, pretty much every religion for thousands of years before, as long as we could write, was talking about like the importance of the transcendent. The wording was different. The way that psychology thinks about it now, it was initially, there's a lot of writing done by someone named William James, who in the early 20th century, maybe was it the late 1890s? It was sometime around then. He wrote Varieties of Religious Experiences, and he talked a lot about the significance of that psychologically and not necessarily metaphysically. And then Abraham Maslow, who, if you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he's one of the most influential psychologists ever. He wrote about peak experiences in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I do think money is very important. I don't know if it's more important than other things because I never tasted it, but I do see how other things. Yeah. So, yeah, I think I do want to. There's a lot of research on the relationship between money and how you spend it. I think like very briefly, the summary of the research is having if you have if you don't have a lot of money, money can do a lot to boost your well-being. If you already have in the United States like a decent salary, some numbers put it at 55K, some people say 75K. Getting more really doesn't influence it much, and even at some of the lower ends, it's more about having your basic needs met. Um, Whip out the money to happiness stat. I mean, yeah, I guess I can. One thing I'm still trying to figure out with this is like how to fluently switch between different windows. Um, but I remember there was a study done by Daniel Kahneman, and in his study in the United States, after 75,000 day-to-day emotional experiences wasn't influenced by money anymore. Um, which means that they would text or page people a few times a day and ask what their mood was like. And after 75,000, that wasn't affected. But life satisfaction, which is the last one that we'll talk about, is like the sense of how your life is going. As people get more money, that does tend to increase more. But I mean, the way that I tend to think about it is it's a cost benefit analysis, right? Like if you're really struggling to pay your bills and you want to get a degree or work more, that might be the most cost benefit and reasonable thing to do to better your life. But depending on just where you are and what your goals are, it's about having a balance between having meaningful work, meaningful relationships, hobbies that you enjoy, physical health, right? So it's always kind of a cost benefit analysis. And I think that I mean, our culture is so focused on getting money and having status, right? I feel like people can say they don't care about how much money you have, but having money plays a role in your attractiveness. Yeah, yeah. I think we can say that we don't care about money as much as we want, but very few people actually like really don't care about money, right? Like they just not even a factor for them because you need money. Like it's almost impossible to function in society and live without money. And I think there's a lot of sociological and cultural factors that we could discuss in terms of how money is distributed or produced, etc. Um, yeah, and I mean, we like I mean, human beings are attracted to status, right? that's just going to be, I mean, that's just going to be true in any culture. Um, we to some extent want to be influential. We admire people who are influential, um, and that's unavoidable to some extent. But what we can do is individually and collectively, we can influence the extent to which money in physical, like material goods, are the metric that for which we say something is meaningful, or like what status is associated with. Like, I'm not super well read on kind of the history of I don't know, other cultures and how they approach material well-being, but I've heard many people say that there have been cultures that really emphasized on like wisdom in like in like the 1800s and 19th century, or 1700s and 1800s. There was more of a like that was still important, but there was more value placed on like having like a strong value system. And there are cultures where like I mean, not just with money, but like in Western culture, as far as I see it, beauty is super valued, especially for women. Whereas there are other cultures where, as women age, it's the wisdom and the maternal that is valued more. I couldn't afford a cell phone before 2018. Once I got one, I noticed I was being segregated. What do you mean you're being segregated of many activities? What do you mean by that? Yeah, I mean, access to social media and the internet and having a phone is such a big part of a modern just culture and socializing. Um, yeah, so the transcendent experiences, um, there's some evidence that like transcendent experiences don't necessarily have to be associated with religion, but they're experiences that are essentially you feel as powerful and as vulnerable simultaneously as you've ever felt, like losing your sense of self, being enthralled on the summit of a mountain, or having an epiphany that's just like you realize something about yourself and it's like it just it hits you. It's really intense, or having a really loving, intimate moment with someone. Um, it's like kind of the highest experiences you can have, drug induced or not in drug induced. And what often happens to people, interestingly, the most well documented um, forms of these have been from research on psilocybin mushrooms. But when people have these peak experiences, a lot of the time they have long lasting shifts in perspective, and they feel more accepting of themselves and others and more curious. Um, and a lot of these experiences come just as you become more curious and open to experiences and pursue things that are meaningful. They can come. So I guess just intense, positive, awe-inspiring experiences. They didn't bother inviting me. So before that, they didn't. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. No, that made sense the first time you said it, Turo. You noticed you were being segregated prior to having your cell phone. You can't see what I'm typing? Oh, it cut off. Thank you. Burdett. Um, yeah, I see what you're saying, Turo. I misread it the first time, but that makes sense. Um, a lot of people use WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, Twitch, Discord to make social connections and plan. Um, you're welcome. Thanks. Thank you. You're welcome. And then satisfaction with life is how you evaluate your life. Which, I mean, that is so mood dependent, right? Like, if I'm really hungry and I didn't have a good day at work and I come home, my brain's going to be telling me a lot of negative things about my life in general. Less so than it used to, but your mood is so the how you feel about your life is like a lot very dependent on your mood. If you just get a call that you got like your dream job, or you ask someone out and they say yes, you're gonna feel really good about your life. There's even like really silly research that um, they had, like, when people found like a dime on top of a copier, I believe in the study, they were way more likely to say that their life as a whole was better than like a control group. So that's interesting. But there's something that psychologists try to parse out, which is the idea, and this is also Daniel Kahneman, the idea of an experiencing self versus remembering self. So we're always going to be our experiencing self, I guess, in some sense, which is an argument that Sam Harris makes and others make. But we don't remember our life, or we don't have memories that are objective recounts of things. And some things we remember more fondly than what they are actually like. So we tend to remember things based on what's called the peak end effect. So we remember moments based on the things that are most emotionally intense or relevant to our identity and the end of things. So when we look back at our life, a lot of times we remember the highs and the lows and things that shaped our identity. Um, and then there's some debate in like the medical community where like certain procedures, if you have like a high point of pain and then stop the procedure, it's going to be remembered far more negatively, and people are less likely to want to get treatment. Whereas on the flip side, what you can do is you could have the procedure, say it's like an 8 in pain, and rather than just stopping, so we remember that was terrible, you slowly, however you're doing the procedure in a way that the pain is reduced slowly. So like say at the end of it it's a 3. So you actually subject people to like say 2 more minutes of mild suffering, but they remember the experience as less terrible because they remember the ending getting less painful and being less painful. So it's like an ethical question of, is it better to make the memory less aversive, and is it ethical to subject people to a little bit more suffering so that the memory is better? So that's like a huge, I guess, question as to what the appropriate way to go about that is. Um, so yeah, I appreciate everyone popping in and contributing to the discussion. I really love talking about psychology, and the fact that I can just go online whenever and just talk about this, and anyone coming and support me is amazing. I'm going to be putting just kind of like the whole thing on YouTube.